In this bonus section, we turn to one of the most fascinating outside witnesses in the entire resurrection discussion, Josephus. The question is not whether Josephus proves the resurrection all by himself. He does not. The question is whether Josephus, a non-Christian Jewish historian, preserves evidence that Jesus' followers were proclaiming resurrection from the very beginning. And that is exactly why this matters. If Thomas Schmidt is right, Josephus gives us external confirmation that resurrection faith was not a late legend, not a second-century invention, and not a story created generations later. It was there at the start. So first, who is Josephus? Josephus was not a random writer far removed from the events. He was born around the same time period, came from an eminent priestly family, knew Jewish religious life from the inside, and moved within elite first-century networks. He was a Pharisee, a priestly insider, a political figure, and a historian. That matters because when Josephus speaks about first-century Judea, he is not guessing from a distance. He is speaking from deep proximity to the world in which Jesus, the apostles, the priesthood, and the early Christian movement first emerged. The famous paragraph we are dealing with is usually called the Testimonium Flavianum. In substance, it says that Jesus was a wise man, that he did remarkable deeds, that he gained followers, that Pilate crucified him, that his followers did not disappear, and that the third day alive again claim became part of their continuing movement. That is explosive. Why? Because if the paragraph is substantially authentic, then Josephus becomes an outside witness, not only to Jesus and his death, but also to the survival of the movement and the resurrection proclamation that defined it. Now here is why the paragraph became controversial. Some of the wording, especially in its strongest form, sounds too Christian for Josephus. So scholars divided into three broad camps. Some said Josephus wrote it basically as we have it. Others said Josephus wrote a core paragraph, but Christians later adjusted some lines. And others said Christians forged the whole thing. The pressure points are obvious. Phrases like, "He was the Christ," the statement about appearing alive on the third day, and references to prophetic fulfillment. Those are the phrases that made many scholars suspicious. But Schmidt argues that the usual skeptical case is far too quick. And here is one of the most important parts of the story. Schmidt did not begin this project as a true believer in the passage. In fact, by his own testimony, he started where many skeptics start. He accepted the common objections, but as he worked through the evidence, he found that the evidence kept pushing him in the opposite direction. That is important. This is not simply someone defending Josephus out of prior commitment. This is a scholar saying the data changed his mind. And that gives the case real weight. He went in expecting to confirm doubt, and came out convinced there was a much stronger case for authenticity. Schmidt's argument is not built on one clever trick or one isolated point. It is cumulative. He looks at manuscripts, translations, reception history, Greek vocabulary, literary style, statistical patterns, context, and source access. In other words, he does not say, "Believe the passage because of one phrase." He says the evidence comes in from multiple directions, and when you let all the pieces speak together, the argument for substantial authenticity grows much stronger. That is exactly the kind of argument we should want. Not a fragile argument hanging by a thread, but a broad case built on converging lines of evidence. The first major move concerns the wording often translated, "He was the Christ." Schmidt argues that ancient evidence points toward a weaker and more believable reading, that Jesus was thought or believed to be the Christ. That matters enormously. Why? Because that sounds far more like Josephus reporting what people believed than Josephus himself making a Christian confession. And once you see that, one of the biggest objections begins to collapse. The line no longer requires Josephus to become a believer. It only requires him to report what others thought about Jesus. That is historically plausible, and it fits the role of Josephus much better. The second major move involves the Greek word paradoxa. Many people assume it straightforwardly means miracles in the fully Christian sense. Schmidt pushes back on that. The word can mean surprising, strange, astonishing, or even suspicious deeds. That matters because it makes the language less devotional and more ambiguous. A Christian forger would be expected to use language that clearly glorifies Jesus. But a more neutral or ambiguous word fits Josephus much better. In other words, this wording does not look like an eager Christian smoothing everything into confessional language. It looks much more like a non-Christian historian describing remarkable deeds in his own way. The third major move concerns the third-day line. Schmidt argues that instead of reading the paragraph as Josephus declaring that Jesus literally appeared alive again, the line may be understood as Josephus reporting that it seemed to Jesus' followers that he was alive again on the third day. That is a massive distinction. Josephus does not have to become a Christian witness to Easter itself. He can remain a Jewish historian reporting the disciples' proclamation. But that is exactly why the paragraph is so valuable. Even on that more careful reading, Josephus still becomes an external witness to the fact that the disciples were publicly proclaiming resurrection, and doing so very early. Schmidt also makes a reception history argument. He looks at how ancient writers received and handled the passage. The point is not that every ancient Christian used it in exactly the same way. The point is that the reception is more complicated than the easy skeptical story allows. If the paragraph were blatant Christian propaganda, we might expect the early handling of it to be much simpler and more uniform. Instead, the evidence suggests a more nuanced reality. That supports Schmidt's larger claim that the paragraph is not an obvious fake sitting out in the open. Rather, it is a passage whose features make better sense if there is a real Josephian core behind it. Then there is the language itself. Schmidt argues that the passage carries Josephian fingerprints. He points to vocabulary, recurring phraseology, stylistic patterns, and broader literary behavior that line up with Josephus. This is important because critics often speak as if the passage is obviously alien to Josephus. Schmidt says, no, that is overstated. The paragraph can be read as behaving in ways consistent with Josephus's own writing habits. And once again, the argument is cumulative. Vocabulary by itself may not settle the question. Style by itself may not settle the question. But together, they help show that the passage fits Josephus better than many critics have assumed. Schmidt also highlights something very interesting. If a Christian had forged this paragraph from scratch, we would probably expect smoother and more obviously devotional wording. Instead, several features are awkward, restrained, or oddly neutral. Phrases such as a certain Jesus, tribe of Christians, and the more cautious formulations surrounding key claims do not sound like triumphant Christian propaganda. They sound more like a non-Christian observer talking about a movement that continued after the death of its founder. Ironically, then, some of the very features critics call suspicious can actually count in the other direction. They are precisely what make the passage look less like a pious forgery. Now we come to one of Schmidt's most intriguing lines of argument. Source access. Could Josephus actually have known the kinds of people who could preserve information about Jesus, the apostles, and the early movement? Schmidt's answer is yes. Josephus came from a priestly family in Jerusalem and moved within precisely the elite circles that intersected with the people involved in Jesus' death and the aftermath. So the question is not whether Josephus could have heard something in theory. The real question is how close Josephus stood to the channels through which that information could flow. Schmidt argues that he stood surprisingly close. This brings us to the phrase, "the first men among us." Schmidt argues that this is not a throwaway phrase, it is a clue. Josephus uses among us language in ways that can suggest direct familiarity with his own circles and social world. If that is right, then the passage is not simply speaking about anonymous Jewish leaders in the abstract. It may be pointing toward elite Jerusalem figures within the world Josephus knew, and that strengthens the historical force of the paragraph. It means Josephus may be reporting on Jesus from within or near the very circles that were involved in condemning him. Schmidt goes further by naming concrete possible lines of contact. He connects Josephus to the high priestly world, including the family lines associated with Annas, Caiaphas, and especially Ananus II. He also explores links touching James, the brother of Jesus, and the broader circles surrounding the early Jerusalem movement. The value of this argument is that it removes vagueness. Josephus is not being treated as some floating ancient witness with no contact to anything. Schmidt is showing possible historical channels through which Josephus could have received information connected to Jesus, his trial, and the movement that followed. This slide puts the source network argument into one visual frame. Josephus sits near several major lines of connection: the high priestly house, Pharisaic and Sanhedrin circles, Jesus and the apostles, James, and even Paul's broader world. Now, this does not mean Josephus personally interviewed every one of these figures. That would overstate the case. But it does mean he was historically well positioned. He lived near the right places, knew the right kinds of people, and moved among the right networks. In historical work, that matters. Proximity of access does not prove every detail, but it greatly strengthens the plausibility that Josephus could preserve genuine early information. So, what is the payoff? The payoff is this: Josephus strengthens the argument that resurrection belief was not a later legend. On Schmidt's reconstruction, Josephus reports a chain of historical realities. Jesus lived. Pilate crucified him. His followers did not abandon him. They proclaimed that he was alive again on the third day. And the movement endured. That is exactly the opposite of the idea that resurrection faith developed much later as a legendary embellishment. Josephus, as an outside witness, supports the idea that resurrection proclamation belongs to the earliest phase of the movement itself. Here is the final verdict. Josephus does not replace the New Testament evidence, and he does not carry the resurrection case alone. But if Schmidt is right, Josephus absolutely belongs in the evidence room. His work gives us an external, non-Christian confirmation that the Jesus movement survived the crucifixion, because it was proclaiming from the beginning that Jesus was alive again. That makes this bonus section powerful. It shows that the resurrection proclamations was not a late myth layered onto a dead movement. It was the core claim of the movement from the start, and Josephus may preserve outside evidence that this was already the message early on.